So, I don't know, what's the math on that?
You're asking the wrong person today.
Over 50 years. I've been doing comics. I started out in undergrounds because both DC and Marvel were like sort of closed shops. They would say, "Oh, we got Gil Kane and Murphy Addison. Well, we need you young guys." And I had met Von Bodie, and he was editing the Sunday Funnies for the East Village Other called the Gothic Woodworks. And all the guys that started underground comics were working in there. I managed to get into there with Von Bodie and Trina Robbins and Kim Deitch and Art Spiegelman and Spain Rodriguez, Jay Lynch, pretty much everybody that started undergrounds. And they also included 3 of us young Turks who were trying to break into regular comics but couldn't get in the door. And that was like me and Bernie Wrightson and Mike Kaluta. Bernie Wrightson was doing a very sort of Graham Ingalls, Ghastly horror thing at the time. And Mike Kaluta was doing a really sort of hippy-dippy script called Star Child. Sort of very cosmic and flowery. But yeah, that's how we were able to get started. And then a lot of us sort of broke in doing horror, black and white horror comics. And in the early 70s, I had an art partner named Ralph Reese, who I'd gone to high school with. When I got out of the Army, I really didn't know what to do. And he said, "Hey, I'm going to start a studio. Why don't you come in on it with me? And because you can pencil faster than I can ink, and I can ink faster than you can pencil. We can maybe make some money." And we started working for National Lampoon and Children's Television Workshop, and we sold illustrations to Esquire, and Rolling Stone, and other places. Still couldn't get in the door at Marvel or DC. And it was finally Neil Adams. I was working in the studio, and he went to DC and said, "Look, if you give this kid an 8-page horror story, I'll ink it." And that's how I got in the door. And that led to me getting more work from DC and from Marvel. But Neil did that for a lot of people. He sort of got in the door at DC and kept his foot in the door. And he was the one who convinced DC to use Jeff Jones for covers, and to use Mike Kaluta and Howie Chaykin and all these other guys. Because the DC editors, they would look at our stuff and go, "Doesn't look like Murphy Anderson." It doesn't look like what we're used to. So that was a hard thing to get over. Anyway, I think I wandered off the subject, but
It's fine.
okay.
You worked at DC for a while as an editor, and you were actually, I just discovered that recently that you were the editor on Warlord comic written by Mike Grell.
Drawn by Mike Grell, too.
Yeah, drawn by Mike Grell. How was that experience?
Well, I remember once I called him. I think he was living in Wisconsin at the time, and I'm talking to him on the phone about the story, and I hear this popping sound. I said, "What's that noise?" And he said, "Oh, I'm sitting here. I'm shooting critters." And I said, "You got a phone in your backyard?" He says, "No, I'm in my studio. I'm shooting through the window." I said, "Oh, okay." But yeah, I've known Mike since 1978.
Now, you got offered GI G.I. Joe in '83.
It wasn't really offered.
Well, listen, how did you get G.I. Joe?
Well, Hasbro came to Marvel and they wanted a comic book based on their toy, G.I. Joe. And you have to understand that at that period, in the early 80s, toy licensed comics were the bottom of the barrel as far as the artists and writers were concerned, because they took the licensing fee off the page rate, which meant that you got less money to work on a toy book, and it was the same amount of work. So no A-list or even a B-list artist or writer, would deign to do it. It's also, toy books never lasted more than a year. They were just, they came and they went. And so if they got anybody to do it, it would be like, some hack who just said, okay, I'm gonna just knock these out as fast as I can. So Jim Shooter asked every contract writer, Marvel contract writer, they all turned it down. And he asked all the non-contract writers, they all turned it down. Then he decided to go from editorial office, one after the other. He started at the other end of the building. And he asked every editor, an assistant editor, and the kid who went out to get coffee. And even the kid who went out to get coffee turned it down. And my office was physically the last office in the row. And he got to my office, and I had been trying to get writing work from Marvel for like a year. I was full editor at Marvel. And I couldn't get a single editor at Marvel to give me writing work. They said, no, you're an artist. If we start letting artists write, that's spitting in our own wallets, because all the editors were writers. And they would play that game where like it was, oh, okay, if I give you stuff to write, will you give me stuff? So they had it all locked down. And I was able to prove to Jim Shooter that no editor at Marvel would give me writing work. And I actually got dispensation to write for other companies while I was an editor at Marvel. So I was writing for Eerie magazine because my old friend Louise, she's now Louise Simonson, but back then she was Louise Jones, was an editor there. So I did a sort of martial arts strip with Val Mayering at Eerie for a while, called A Young Master. And so, Shooter offered me this book, and I said, sure. But literally, if it had been Barbie, I would have taken Barbie. Because really, I hadn't, doing a military comic was not the reason I got into comics. I'm basically a duck man. I wanted to do, Carl Barks was my idol. I wanted to do funny animals. But, in 1970s, early 70s, when I was trying to get in, nobody was buying funny animals. So I figured, well, I could do superheroes, I guess. But it was my one way to get in the door. And, I had been working with Neil Adams for a few years at that point. And I sort of absorbed his ethic, which is like, no matter what the job is, you give it, your 100%. There's no such thing as a B job. And you force yourself to like what you're doing, and you give it your best shot. So that's what I felt about doing G.I. Joe. And it's also, the other reason for taking it on was ethically, I didn't like the idea of some armchair general sitting there writing military comics for kids. That's why, G.I. Joe was never very jingoistic or very rah-rah. It was all told from the point of view of an enlisted run with all their peccadillos. And I guess that's what, reverberated with the readers.
Personally, I'm picking up on the IDW run. Your writing, it brought a way to humanize some of these characters that Steve Pete, for example, as a child, I never really cared for that character. But reading some of the issues when you started out with the IDW, and how he came back and was undercover, and this one scene I remember was where he was telling his mother that he was alive and she didn't know who he was. That really, I thought, was great writing and really made you care about the character. Is there any particular character that you yourself care about more, or your favorite that you'd like to add personality to?
Well, to me, the core characters are Snake Eyes, Scarlet, Stalker, and Duke. Most of the backstory revolves around them. But almost all the characters are based on people I know. They may not have the same physical traits or whatever, but they're, it's the personalities. And to me, that's the most important thing for me about writing these stories was to nail down the characterization and make the characters stand up and walk around. Because, to me, the plot is just a device to hang the characters on. When I was an editor, I would tell my writers that I thought the plot was absolutely secondary. Writers come to the field thinking the plot is everything, And I would say, well, have you ever read Peanuts? And of course we've read Peanuts. And I said, okay, tell me what happens in any one given Peanuts Sunday strip. And they all go, well, Lucy is holding the football. And Charlie Brown comes running up, and as he's going to kick it, she snatches it away, and Charlie Brown falls on it. I said, that's just a setup. That's, the regular setup. What's the punchline? What's the plot? What's the story? Nobody can tell you. Later on, I would say, oh, you seen all the Harry Potter movies? Tell me the plot of any one. And people are like, well, there's this goblet of fire. But at the same time, I say, write me a psychological profile of any of the Peanuts characters, or Schroeder, or Lucy, or anything. And you can, because you know these characters because you've learned about them incrementally, like you meet real people. You learn a little bit every day, and after a while you assemble this, really detailed impression of the character.